The Indian Constitution is about 75 years and has been amended 103 times. In the recent past, the Constitution has jeopardized the idea of equality for all. The Assembly got on the task of drafting the Indian Constitution on December 9, 1946 to meet the ambitions of millions of Indians. The Assembly convened for close to 3 years to draw the document that would parent the newly born nation, granting it political security and a future filled with prosperity. India's constitution is very large, gives the government enormous power to intervene in the economy, allows the government to enact laws that discriminate among citizens based on attributes such as sex, religion, and caste, restricts freedom of speech, and limits the right to property. In short, it allows political and economic exploitation. India is a functioning democracy with routine peaceful transfer of power following elections. Each election raised the hope that with different political leaders, governance would improve. Nobel laureate economist James Buchanan wrote, "It is folly to think that better men elected to office will help us, that better policy will turn things around here. We need and must have basic constitutional reform, which must, of course, be preceded by basic constitutional disclosure and discussion. India needs a constitution that is consistent with a nation of free individuals living in a complex, modern, large economy. This modern constitution has to be one that guarantees economic freedom to the individuals, prohibits the government from making any laws that discriminate among citizens, guarantees freedom of speech and the press, prohibits the government from entering into businesses that are properly the domain of private sector, and so on. In other words, India needs a constitution that protects the comprehensive freedom of the individual, economic, social and political." Krishangi Sinha, Democracy News Live, New Delhi.
Thank you for joining viewers to It Matters on Democracy News Live. We're discussing a fairly controversial topic today, but it must be discussed. What we are discussing is which is the very basis of India, India's constitution. What we are talking about is India's constitution a weak document? Now, we've heard this over and over again, that great laws, poor implementation. Now, what we are trying to investigate and take a closer look at, was this document that was written, the India's constitution, was it written in good letter and faith? And then there were some loopholes still left which are being misused at a level to be able to be utilized by political structures as they come and go for changing the landscape. Now, there are certain documents in the world, when you actually take a look at it, it's very, very difficult to change it. I remember in the United States, for example, if you take a look at the gun laws, they always go back to, it's my right to hold a weapon. If you go to Canada, you take a look at, the education structure. They say the Catholics and the Protestants have a school system, the separate systems. One is the public, one is the Catholic system, and they can't have anything more because that was the letter and spirit of the document that was created. But today, as we see India unfold, we're seeing a tremendous amount of changes. An ordinance was passed, this law was passed, and while this was not the original idea of it, and changes were made, we are talking about, Article 370, we're talking about farm laws, we're talking about all the other things that we see in front of us. So I decided to speak with a young group of panelists who understand, who are debating, who are grappling with the law. This is the future of this country. Joining me is Shilpa Singh. She is a political scientist and has been studying the constitution around it. Also joining me is Pallav Palit. He's a lawyer, he's an advocate, and works out of New Delhi. Also joining me is Kalandi Kokal. She is submitting a PhD. She works on human rights law. First, let me start with Shilpa. Shilpa, will you please give me a sense in terms of, if I were to say that India's constitution is a weak document, would you agree with it or do you disagree with it?
I think I'll agree with it largely. And one thing that we need to understand is whether the constitution document is weak or whether implementation is weak. I'm of a view that the constitution itself is weak. And why I have this opinion, if we understand the genesis of liberal constitutionalism, we the people of India, it signifies that the constitution is will of the masses. It is expression of common will of masses. Uh, at one level, if we see, the Indian constitution has been created on the basis of the Constituent Assembly, which itself was chosen on the basis of limited franchise. So there was no universal adult franchise. 1935 Government of India Act had imposed a lot of qualification, which actually roughly made a very minuscule population entitled to vote in the elections to the Constituent Assembly. So, at one level, we can say this is a technical thing that it was not representative. But even if we see theoretically from the domain of political theory, liberal constitution actually reproduces the power relation between the sovereign and the subject. Because when we assume that we are giving ourselves this constitution, when we assume that we are signing a document on our behalf, we are actually, it is people who are doing it, or it is the existing dominant powerful forces in society who have been instrumental in creation of that constitution. So suppose if we see the genesis of liberal constitutionalism, if we see from the critical perspective, it was because of to put down the curtain on the feudal values and to give expression to the new values which were emerging due to emergence of capitalism. So we can say safely that the constitution is actually the constitution as a document reproduces the existing or historical power relations, the liberal constitution also, because the right to property, right to life, right to liberty, even when it came in Europe, it was only at one pole. For European countries, we had liberty, we had a kind of right to property and life. And when you say at the same time, the countries of the global south were victims of imperialism, and you see the condition of colonial India, how freedom of liberty, or how the conditions existed for the common masses of India. There was no liberty, there was no freedom. So it has
Right.
been always a contradictory thing that liberal constitutionalism has never moved in a uniform direction where there have been not two set of people, the sovereign and the subjects.
Sure. So
So
I think so. What you're saying is that first of all, not representative enough because the groupings of people that chose to write this constitution weren't representatives, weren't true representatives. Secondly, the relationship between the subject and the state is still kind of structured in a way that there is no way, there is no recourse for the subject to make sure that they have enough representation beyond for the constitution itself. I want to break this down a bit. One of the things which I've always debated about the incumbency of delivering the constitution or following the constitution or following the laws is on the citizen. Let's say I go out on the street and I'm not wearing a helmet. I'm given a ticket. I go out and I don't wear a mask, for example. I'm given a ticket. Said, here you go, pay this much. So everything is the responsibility of the citizen. But let's say I go out on the road and there's a hole on the road. Why isn't the bureaucrat fined? Said, I'm sorry, you're not going to get your salary because this is what you were responsible for. So the Constitution held, I don't know how it structured it, but was it even able to, put all of this in? I know and I understand when we talk about Constitution, we're going beyond these basics. I'm just trying to make the audience understand from a basic level. Similarly, when we look at how the Constitution will be implemented, let's say the rights of the tribals, right? The tribals lived off the jungles so many hundreds and thousands of years. Now right now they've been, a lot of the jungles have been taken over in the name that these tribals are not incapable of maintaining them. They may have maintained it for thousands of years, but no longer are they capable of maintaining them. Now, wasn't there a principle designed around these ideas? Was this whole thought process missing in the Constitution of India?
uh, I believe one very important thing that I missed out while I was introducing the thing. Uh, the relationship between sovereign and subject. We assume that the constitution that we are giving to us has no interest of its own. It represents only the larger interest of society. So that accords legitimacy to the state to do whatever it wants to, because the sovereignty that it is exercising upon us is legitimate, because we assume that the constitution and this state exist for us. So that also enables state monopoly over legitimate use of force, in words of Max Weber, that it is only the state which has monopoly to indulge in legitimate use of force through various repressive state apparatus, including the police, military, and the courts as well. So when we see the power relations that exist in society and how state reproduces, or how the constitutional document actually does not give any way out through which this power relations can be dismantled in totality. So suppose if I give you example, like the caste relations were tried to be tackled through affirmative action, but what about land relations in the sense we tried land reforms, but till date, as per socioeconomic caste census, 90% of Dalits are landless. So you can see the historical, at one level, affirmative action can give certain kind of concession to few people, but the larger picture of land relations, which were actually based on hereditary property and lineage, that has not been gone. So monopoly over legitimacy of use can also be interpreted in the way how we uh, curb the individual rights, or how we treat dissenters, protesters, and how we repress the protest movement. Because we assume the state has legitimacy, state is doing everything in the interest of people. So at one level, state is claiming we are doing this in interest of people. At the same level, you see that whether it is the colonial relic, IPC section 124A, which where not only an act of sedition, even speech of sedition can be used to imprison you, used to throttle the free speech, and any kind of dissent and dissatisfaction with the state can put you behind the bar. And also the kind of violence which is being
Yeah.
used against the protesting farmers, these all are
Right.
expression of monopoly of state to use legitimate force, and we have no recourse against this, because if we take up weapons, that is sedition. So only state has a right to break the protocol of peace. It is not the people who can break the protocol of peace, so they are only at the receiving end.
Important
So
point.
police can hit
Shilpa,
us, they can largely charge us. Yeah.
Shilpa, you're making a very important point, and in the light of the farmer protests going on, the amount of force that is being used, these are peaceful protesters, and the idea of banning them out of Delhi, the center of, the power in India, for them to protest, to stop them on the way, and the kind of force that's been used obviously is being talked about a lot. And so people's right to protest is very much a part of the Constitution. Now, they obviously can't put in sedition into anything like that, or they can't, begin now morphing this into something else. It is what it is. But as we've seen on some, even news networks have started, twisting the farmer protest as an anti-national protest, which is absolutely the wrong journey to take. Now, I want to go back to the idea of, you talked about Max Weber. The Max Weberian thought process was around the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Uh, uh, Very much, as we read Weber through, our growing years, we understood that it was more the incumbency, the structure of the state was designed in a certain fashion to be able to make sure that people fell in line with the state. And so Protestantism was used to kind of bring in the value system that a capitalistic society required. And so it's the flip side. Now, instead of that process, India obviously went for a balance between the Bavarian thought process and then, a communism, if you want to call it that, the socialist, central path that India took. Now, what you're saying is the constitution does not even, provide enough center of the, line situation between them, between Max Weber and Karl Marx, for that matter. So what you're saying is this constitution is incapable. Can we talk a bit about Article 370 here? I know it's a very controversial issue, A lot of people, would slam it possibly. But I want to discuss the process of dismantling Article 370. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's for the people of this country to decide, and the people who run this country as politicians to decide. But was that process in some ways scuttle the way it was supposed to be? Because as part of the whole original idea was that the JK Assembly would vote on it and then it could be implemented. Do you look at the way Article 370 was, removed and then now is in place? Is that a process that was not designed in the Constitution and they didn't think about it?
Yes, so here you can see there's a case where already the constitution had provisions, and even those provisions are being bypassed. So at one level, we can say the constitution itself is weak, but whatever the existing safeguards in the constitution. So to see that the people of Jammu and Kashmir, their willingness, their welfare, and their interest, and especially their will is not suppressed and it is given due regard. The way the means the Article 370 was actually a kind of a compromise to give representation, to give autonomy to Kashmir. So you can say that it was an expression of extending the right of sovereignty of Kashmiri people to decide their political future and whether they could do without Article 370 or not. But when we see the manner in which the Article 370 was done away with, it reflects that, and even for that regard, even ordinances, the way they are made. So, even if the constitution structure has safeguards in place, that has been totally dismantled without any due regard, even to the due process of law and the way the constitution should work. So, actually, it is the question that how they can actually use uh, pretext which the loopholes which exist in the constitution to do away with it, and the supreme court also not intervening and trying to, so means you can see that the constitution, the way it exists today, even whatever safeguard it has, that is being
Not being followed.
distorted in such a manner, yeah, that is being
It's
distorted
not
in
being
such a
followed.
manner that whatever small liberties and whatever the federal system power relations used to exist, where at least there was balance, trying to strike balance between the people of the state and the central authority, that is also being totally devastated. So you see
Really?
that Kashmir, yeah.
No, no, go ahead. You were saying something about Kashmir.
Yeah, so I was saying that if you see the kind, not just only about the 370, the aftermath of 370, how issue was tackled, no internet, nobody can come out of their houses. So it is not only the 370 going, there was no dialogue, there was no engagement, there was not any attempt part on government to take into confidence the people of Jammu and Kashmir, besides their media propaganda and whatever kind of propaganda they do using their friends, using the money of the corporate. So if I just try to tell you that there was no, means forget about the constitutional mechanisms of 370, but how it was imposed upon people. So it is not at all reflecting the democratic ethos, even from any angle that used to exist in the
Sure.
past.
Sure. So,
So
I went to Pakistan in 2010 and I saw what they did because there was so much of terrorism, and we see a similar format in India. There is tremendous amount of terrorism. For example, the latest militants that have been killed in the attack in Nagrota, uh, and I was given, a confirmation from the Pakistani side that they were Pakistanis who were fighting on the ground. So certainly there is an international, effort in Kashmir to try and dismantle it from India. Obviously, we saw the late 80s, 90s, see the cleansing of the Kashmiri Hindus out of there. So I think those are all challenging areas. But Pakistan, what it did, I was quite surprised to see. What they did is they went into the Swat Valley. They cleared out the whole Swat Valley. They did the same thing with Waziristan as well. They said all citizens must leave. The military went in, spent the next 6 months, year there, cleaned out every bit of terrorism that existed, closed all boundaries, and then began again. Possibly a process like that would have been a better idea rather than changing the schematics of it without having people on site. And when people went back in, they could go back with a new gusto. You could reinstate the populations back, which used to exist, which means the genocide that happened through the 80s and 90s can then be reversed. But that kind of an approach has not been taken. So when I looked at the Pakistani approach in 2009-10, when I was in there in Waziristan and Swat, I looked at it and said, "Oh my God, this is really regressive." But it was a tremendous effort. It's an effort that a country makes. What the Indian government is trying to do in Kashmir possibly is a half-baked step. They need to possibly cleanse out the place. They need to make it again, viable for the all the population that have been pushed out of Kashmir to go back into their places. Whatever land property sales that happened should be reversed back to 1989, and it should start from scratch again. They said, all right, whatever has happened has happened. The government is going to fund it and is going to return back all the money and make sure reinstate the land based in 1989, and then you can go back many steps. So while yes, I agree with you that the constitution has been bypassed, and possibly that's one of the small ways when we look at the constitution. Are there anything beyond Kashmir that when you look at the constitution and you see that the constitution has not been able to deliver?
Yes, absolutely. So, first of all, I would like to say that from a perspective of historically marginalized communities or underprivileged people, whether it is women, I see constitution is patriarchal. And if you see adultery law, which was struck down just last year, even there are many things in Hindu Succession Act where property, the right to property to women in her households was only recently recognized. Even triple talaq issue for that regard, that how the existing this means the relations, patriarchal relations are reproduced at one level. But if we see even from the level of Adivasis, the way they are being dispossessed from their land, and the kind of safeguards, like even if they have Forest Right Act, means do we actually doing that, the environmental impact assessment, and are we taking consent of Gram Sabha? There have been a lot of breach where lands have been taken with, even when we have a protective law, the consent of people is not being taken. It is just had been mechanical. And I think today the most dangerous thing that we have today is not just that existing law has been used in a oppressive manner. We have actually laws which are oppressive. So I'm talking about UAPA, Unlawful Prevention Activities Act. So if you see, there was a recent amendment to that act where it entails that a person without any institutional affiliation can be charged under UAPA, and that can involve just a seminar proceedings if you're presenting some ideas in seminar, or if you are speaking or you're writing something against the state or something against the critical of the state without any organizational affiliation to any extremist group, you can still be tried under UAPA. So means we have reached to the extent where that not using the existing laws of oppression, but making a law as a tool of oppression to curb dissent, to curb the democratic right to protest, and to have freedom of thought and freedom of speech and expression where we can see state critically. So I would like to say that this is one of the very important means the regime change in Indian constitution that we see. So UAPA can actually target anybody today. So if I'm speaking today like this, so like speaking on Kashmir made me a little apprehensive that if I say something tomorrow, they may file sedition against me, or I may be charged with UAPA. So I'm just trying to tell you
I
there's
hear
so much,
you.
there's so much
No,
fear.
and I think that being fearful in a democracy certainly does not talk a great deal about a democracy. Being fearful for being speaking your mind, putting out your perspective should never be a challenge in a democracy. A healthy debate is a great idea. A healthy debate creates better collaborative societies rather than creating a institution of fear. Shilpa, I want to thank you for joining me for this show. I'm now going to go to Pallav Palit and Kalandi Kokal and get their view on it. Let me start by asking Pallav. Pallav, do you see something in this constitution, the laws, the way they have been structured in the constitution, that they can be bypassed, the constitution can be bypassed, and new laws can be formulated without, giving enough thought, just by strategizing a bit. Do you think the constitution is weak?
Hi, Rohit. First of all, many thanks for having me. Firstly, with respect to your question, I would say that in a democratic country such as ours, it is a regular feature to waste our government with enormous powers. These powers are essentially powers which have only been borrowed by the government from the citizens of the country, who have merely assigned their sovereignty to an elected set of representatives for governing the affairs of the country in order to further their hopes and aspirations. Now, our constitution itself mandates and presumes that the government will discharge these functions with absolute fairness and in sync with the constitutional values. Now, if you were to talk about the present union government, since the time they've stepped in to power, one could recount many such instances where one would say that the government has exceeded its power and misused its powers and have acted against the interests of the country. To highlight a few, maybe the criminalization of the student protesters of JNU, where charges of sedition were leveled against a certain group for holding an event where protests were being made. Several instances where one would critique that the freedom of expression of citizens have been curbed because of the very fact that they were not aligned with the views and ideals professed by a ruling political party. There's a strong criticism of the present government that it constantly keeps on interfering and disturbing the autonomy of various institutions, namely the RBI, the CBI, the Vigilance Commission, etc. Bigger issues such as the abrogation of Article 370, the enactment of the Citizenship Amendment Act, and many, many more. Now, coming to the second part of your question, which is as to whether this capacity of the government to misuse its powers, somehow correspondingly implies that our constitution is weak. Being a lawyer and a continuous student of law, who has had some kind of a opportunity to read and understand the constitution and also follow its evolution over the years, I would say I would find it extremely difficult to basically accommodate a suggestion that the constitution is weak. In fact, our constitution is a very strong and secure document which was given to us by our very wise, competent, and I would say very far-sighted forefathers who helped us in drafting the constitution. When we started preparing the constitution, we should remember that we were in a state of extreme conflict. We were fighting to overthrow an imperialistic government headed by a monarch to achieve a democratic nation. Keeping in due regard our past circumstances and a wide diversity of our country, the Constituent Assembly members did massive deliberations, discussions, and research while drafting this constitution. We went and scoured through the constitutions of many other countries, such as USA, France, Australia, Japan, etc. And from them, we borrowed various beneficial parts and tailored our constitution to best suit the aims, objects, the goals, the hopes, aspirations, and the interests of our countrymen. Eventually, what we got was a very, very fabulous document, which is essentially a governing tool which contains all attributes which would not only cater to the needs of that time, but also very much be very relevant and adjustable to the needs of the future. Now, the strength of the constitution stems from the fact that our constitution is a dynamic and a flexible constitution. It is not rigid in any way. And, constitutional experts will tell you that it's a living and breathing document. By living and breathing, I mean that it has a capacity to basically, an inbuilt capacity to change according to the needs and requirements of the relevant time, while of course retaining its original structure, values, and ethos. Now, we must understand that the Constitution by itself is only a textbook. The implementation of the Constitution is assigned to various organs and agencies of the state, which has an inherent duty and responsibility to discharge its functions in sync with the constitutional values, and not in any manner which would derail or impinge upon the rights of the citizens. Now, what happens when one particular organ or the government basically doesn't act according to the constitution, and basically tries to basically infringe upon rights? uh, at that situation, the judiciary steps in. Now, the judiciary, which is the courts of the country, and most importantly, the constitutional courts, which are the High Courts and the Supreme Court, the courts have been given this duty and responsibility to review the actions of the government on the touchstone of the constitutional values, and as such is vested with the power to strike down all actions of the government which they feel are excessive, arbitrary, or in breach of the essential fundamental rights or the constitutional rights which is given to citizens of the country. Now, I feel that this duty, time to time, has been discharged very well by the courts of our country, and we must definitely appreciate that many of the rights which we today enjoy, many of our fundamental rights which have emerged from Article 21, has happened because of the due discharge of this duty and a meaningful interpretation given to the Constitution by our courts. Because of such judgments, we enjoy great rights in the country, which are very precious to us. So, coming back to your question, whether the excessive actions of the government can be stopped and loopholes can be plugged, I feel definitely our constitution has a great capacity and power to do that anytime it wants. However, this power has to be exercised by the courts of the country, and that is why strengthening of the court system is absolutely important and necessary at all times, and maintaining the independence of judiciary is absolutely essential.
Kalandi Kokul is a human rights lawyer. She is still submitting her PhD. Uh, Kalandi, you've traveled around India. You've seen enough happening on the ground with tribals, with people who live in the mountains. Explain to me, when you actually look at the landscape of India, do you see that the Indian constitution has been misused by the government of India?
Rohit, I don't know if the question of the protection of the rights of a minority community, and particularly with reference to your question, Adivasi communities, can be answered entirely only by referring to the manner in which the constitution is interpreted. I think social justice, which includes rights protection, has more to do with access to justice than legislative politicking. As far as accessing justice is concerned, and I don't think this is anything new for any of us, if it means being able to access state institutions such as government schools, hospitals, police stations, or even employment opportunities in the public sector, I don't think we have a record of being very fair and indiscriminate. So, in that sense, I think we have a very long way to go. But let me add that this is not just a systemic issue which has to do with state institutions and the way in which they function. I think it has to do much more with an overhaul in the societal mindset about how we think about minority communities, Adivasi communities, and our relationship with them. So I think the idea about wondering whether just the way in which the constitution is interpreted and whether that has a direct impact on the suppression of the rights of Adivasi communities, I think that's a very narrow way of looking and thinking about the rights of these communities. Yeah.
So, from your perspective, do you think that the Constitution is a weak document?
So thanks for this question, Rohit. I think in more recent times, the Constitution has been perceived as a philosophy, as a philosophical document, rather than just a legal document or a legal project. And so many judgments, like the one on the Aadhaar and the one that decriminalized homosexuality, you hear the judges talking about concepts like constitutional morality, and the values that underlie the constitution and so forth. In fact, many of our judges have gone so forth to call the constitution a living document. So I think any evaluation or reflection on any law or judgment calls for us to reflect on these issues in light of this evolving approach to reading the Constitution. And so, to answer your question now, I mean, there are two amendments that I would sort of comment on, which have happened in the recent past, and the way in which they impact, our societies. So, the first one, of course, is the the amendment to Article 370 of our constitution, and this has received a lot of footage in the media, so I'll just come back to that a little later. But another amendment was the sort of the inclusion of 10% reservation for an economically backward class. So this is a new category that the government has introduced for reservation, and it has significant impacts. Now, yes, it does have advantages, but I think these advantages are limited to an intra-community discourse. So the discourse within and the debates within minority communities, yes, this reservation may have certain significant advantages and disadvantages, or maybe perceived to have these. But in a broader sense, in the broader context, I think the introduction of such a reservation defeats the purpose of the reservation that we had for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes already. So caste-based reservation, as we all know, has a history. It's a history that is embedded in discrimination, exploitation, and grave inequality. So even today, we haven't engaged with these issues vis-a-vis scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. We've not engaged with them intensively and entirely. And therefore, so to sort of pit this sort of a reservation with this history against a reservation, against the disadvantages that come with economic backwardness, I think is not fair. And especially given that there would be a considerable overlap between the groups that will try to access sort of these type of reservations. So I think we're just not ready right now to see the advantages or the benefits of a reservation for economically backward classes. So that's one. Now to come to the issue of Article 370. I mean, this amendment, like I said previously, has received a lot of footage, and I want to refrain from saying anything about whether this amendment was good or bad or necessary or unnecessary. What I want to go straight to is the process by way of which this amendment was sort of made, and especially in light of what I spoke about earlier, that is, the very values of justice, equality, liberty, fraternity that our constitution endorses. And any amendment, I think, to the law that is known to, if the law is known to specifically impact a particular section of our society or a particular community, such an amendment has to be brought about only after giving the said community, an opportunity to be heard. I mean, this is not just fair under law, like legal processes, but also within the broader context of justice, the broader ideas of justice. And I think the suddenness of this amendment, combined with what probably one would call strategic politics, it may have made this amendment procedurally sound. So we can't argue, that it was arbitrary or things like that. But it was a violation of the morality and the essence of our constitution. And the constitution, is a national document. It is the way in which citizens define their rights vis-a-vis the state. And therefore, any law, has to include, like the making of any law, has to include and reflect the voice and the emotions of the people that actually make this document valuable or give it any value.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you, Kalandi, and thank you, Pallav. The idea that the Indian Constitution must not be misused, abused, played with is a very important one, because it's a document you want to hold with great respect. You want to make sure that you respect every part of it. If there are loopholes in it, we should in fact figure out a way of plugging those loopholes to make sure that it becomes a sacrosanct document. People don't start to play with that document like that. The idea is a democracy should function with its people along with it. It's about making sure the people's hearts are aligned with the government. They are not adversaries, they are partners, they're collaborators. And that's how you build a great nation. That's how you build great democracies. Democracies are very strong ideas, democracies are very delicate ideas. And democracies can only function well when people all stand together. They can progress. They do not suppress people, they collaborate, they talk, they converse. And that's something many people have to still learn. Thank you for joining me for It Matters. Thank you. Good night and good luck.